So I think I'll kick things off and then any other latecomers can just join us as we go. So hello and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us. Um, my name is David Livy. I am the Policy and Public Affairs Manager here at SCVO, and this is our budget webinar. So thanks for everyone for coming along. We have three fantastic speakers today covering all things budget, so and what it means for the voluntary sector, the public sector, and Scotland as a whole. So we are lucky to be joined by Mairi Spowage, who is a Professor of Practice at the University of Strathclyde and Director of the Fraser of Allander Institute. Mairi will be telling us about the impact of the budget on the wider economic picture here in Scotland and what this might mean for charities. We'll also have SCVO's own Sheghley Ogilvie taking on how the budget directly impacts voluntary sector and here in Scotland as well. And last but certainly not least, we'll have Mirren Kelly, Chief Officer covering local government and finance at COSLA. Mirren will be looking at how the budget impacts local government and how this might affect the voluntary sector as well. So after our speakers have each spoken, about 10 to 15 minutes each, we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. If you have any questions, put them in the chat throughout. I'll be keeping an eye on that, along with who you are, the organisation that you're representing, and who your question is directed at. And just so everyone's aware, we're recording this session here today so that we'll be able to share it afterwards on our YouTube channel so that even more folk can benefit from the insights of our speakers here today. So enough from me. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker today, Mairi Spowage, Director of the Fraser of Allander Institute.
Thanks, David, and thanks for inviting me along today. As many of you will know who've been following what the FAI has been producing in the run-up to the budget, and since we've been thinking a lot about the implications of the budget for the wider economy, and indeed the implications of the state of the wider economy on the budget and the extent to which that's driving the resources that are available to the Scottish Government. We presented quite a lot of material in the run-up to the budget, which suggested that it would be quite a difficult budget for the Scottish Government. Indeed, perhaps one of the most difficult budgets since devolution. And the reasons for that were many-fold. The Deputy First Minister presented in the medium-term financial strategy in May of last year that the gap between the sorts of spending commitments that they had and the likely resources available was very large. And even at that point in the year, they were saying it was around £1 billion for resource spending and maybe as much as £500 million for capital spending. We did what we could based on the publicly available information, which is not as transparent as it could be, in terms of the extra spending commitments they had made over the course of the year, including things like the council tax freeze, but also the commitment on social care and other childcare workers, pay and so on, to try and understand what the position might be in the run-up to the budget. And we thought it was probably around the same position, where there was £1.5 billion gap between what they wanted to do and what they were likely to have resources for. Lots of things had been promised as part of this budget settlement, which we had been hoping to see. More details on public service reform. There's been a lot of discussion about what the current budget situation might mean for the public sector workforce, where the workforce may be reduced, for example, in order to ensure sustainability. So we were hoping for more details about how the government would approach public service reform. We were also hoping for some information about the expected level of public sector pay awards in the next financial year. Around half of the Scottish budget is made up of public sector wages. So this is a really important thing to understand in what the government are expecting in terms of wage rises in the next year to ensure that other budget lines are affordable. Because for the last 2 years, what we've had is in-year budget revisions, emergency budget revisions, which have led to some cuts to quite, to vital services, particularly in the area of employability, for example. And then what we were also hoping for was some detail on multi-year budgets, which the DFM had promised in the run-up as recently as November, I think, which obviously for many of you who are on this call, I know that will be close to your heart in terms of understanding to what extent you can guarantee funding, not just from one year to the next, but perhaps for the next 3 years or something like that. In the end, we never really got any of that. We never got anything meaningful, I would say, on public service reform. There's clearly more noises that the size of the public sector workforce had to shrink. Lots of euphemisms were used for this about the size and nature or shape of the public sector having to change. But in the end, what it means is that it's not sustainable in its current form, and it does need to shrink overall. And there was very little about what that reform actually looks like and what areas the government are actually targeting to deliver services in a different way, rather than just sort of salami slicing budgets and telling service areas they just need to cope. We never got anything on multi-year budgets either. With this, I do have a little bit more sympathy with the DFM. There was very little certainty given by the UK government at the autumn statement about what's happening past the next financial year. Perhaps understandably, it is the general election here this year, but the spending plans going forward that were presented by the UK government after the next financial year are just, they're either completely unrealistic and will be overshot, or they suggest very big cuts to public services. So I do have some sympathy with the DFM's ability to be able to say anything on a multi-year basis based on information provided by the UK government. I would say overall, when we saw the budget after all of the data was presented, including importantly the forecasts by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, that the situation was not as bad as we expected, certainly on resource funding. And there was one key reason for this, and this was because of the view of the Fiscal Commission of what's happening to Scottish earnings. Now, this might sound like quite a technical point, but what's happening to Scottish earnings, particularly if you compare it to what the OBR thinks is happening to UK level earnings, is really important because it drives our income tax receipts, which in the end drives our overall budget envelope. So the Scottish Fiscal Commission thinks that Scottish earnings are going to grow considerably faster than the OBR thinks UK earnings are going to grow in the next financial year. Now, that has been happening in the sort of current year. There has been some degree of catch-up between Scottish and UK earnings, but there's a really critical assumption that the SFC think that the earnings outlook is so positive for Scotland. It's clear in their analysis that they think the OBR are underestimating earnings at the UK level, and they feel that their forecast is more realistic. But the net result of it is, given the way that the fiscal framework operates, is that the addition to the block grant of Scottish receipts is severely outweighing the deduction which happens based on the OBR forecasts. So it means that the net position for the Scottish budget actually is pretty healthy and is much healthier than it's been in previous years. So although we pay, and we'll come on to this, much more income tax in Scotland in total than we would if the UK rates prevailed, we're sort of getting all of the benefit of that into the Scottish budget now, but that certainly wasn't the case before. So it's a real important assumption, which, to be honest, has much bigger implications for the Scottish budget than any of the income tax policy changes they made as part of these budget announcements. So that's the first key thing that I would say has driven the position not being as bad as we had expected. So on the tax decisions that were made, the headlines were grabbed by the income tax changes, and particularly the introduction of a new band of income tax between 75 and 125,000. Excuse me, the advance rate of income tax. Now, this raises only a little amount of money because only 5% of taxpayers are actually at this income level. So it raises £74 million, which is not to be sniffed at, of course, but it's much less significant than the assumptions about earnings that I was just talking about. There's also an addition to the top rate of income tax, which moves from 47 to 48p in the pound. That raises very little money, only £8 million, after behavioural impacts are taken into account by the Fiscal Commission. So these got all of the coverage, because what we have now is a very different income tax regime to the rest of the UK. It's much more complicated. We have 6 bands instead of 3. And what it means is that we, in aggregate, are paying around £1.5 billion more in income tax than we would if the UK rates prevailed. And that people further up the income distribution, individuals, are paying considerably more tax. The starter rate in Scotland does mean that the Scottish Government can legitimately say that most taxpayers are paying less tax in Scotland than they would if they were in the rest of the UK. But this is to the tune of only £23 per year. So it's true, but it's a very minor amount. So that's got to be borne in mind when we think about the extent to which people will feel better off in Scotland as taxpayers. There's been a lot of discussion about behavioural impacts of these changes, and particularly the growing differential between Scotland and the rest of the UK. To my mind, it's focused too much on this idea of migration and, you know, the idea that because of higher tax rates, people will be fleeing Scotland with bags of money, which is not really what we mean when we talk about behavioural impacts. It's more about the labour market incentives that are driven by tax rates. So whether people will want to work those extra hours, gain that extra promotion, these sorts of things, if they feel it's worth their while. And like it or not, labour market incentives exist all the way up the income distribution, and they do drive people's behaviour, and indeed may drive behaviour such as putting more money into pensions and so on. So behavioural impacts do exist. They are significant, and they become more significant the further up the income distribution you go. And that's not people doing anything nefarious, it's just rational reactions to higher tax rates. The other big announcement was that indeed the council tax freeze would go ahead. I'm sure some others who are speaking will have some views on that. We did quite a lot of modelling prior to the budget to say what fully funded would mean, because that was a commitment of the Scottish Government. And I think the figure that was landed upon will not be considered by COSLA to be fully funding the income tax freeze. I'm going to give a spoiler for what Mirren's going to say there. And, you know, if you take into account the planned increases to the multipliers that were being consulted on, it probably covers about half of what councils could have expected. So no doubt that will be a continuing area of conversation between COSLA and the Scottish Government. When we think about the impacts for charities and the voluntary sectors of the budget, obviously the portfolio movements are of interest. Then we'll talk about local government and the impacts that might have on funding of things like social care, or in particular, given the restrictions on the capital budget, on things like housing and homelessness services and these sorts of things that many of you will be involved in. Economic development funding has also taken a right battering in the budget, and that might have implications for community and charitable organisations and communities. The culture portfolio, though, did a bit better in this budget, with quite a healthy settlement. But digging into the detail, we're still looking at this, but it's difficult to see how the portfolio kind of maps onto the functions to do with culture. And it might be that culture's just kind of gone back to where it was a couple of years ago, rather than it being a really good news story. But it does look fairly healthy, the cultural settlement. Just quickly to finish, I guess what we see is in store for the kind of economic conditions in 2024, which might be relevant. Inflation has been higher for longer than was expected, but we will expect that it will continue to come down, hopefully, over the course of 2024. Albeit that the trade disruptions that are happening in the Red Sea at the moment are quite concerning for prices for all of us, and it might lead to a spike in inflation again. We might see interest rates start to come down, which will mean that people start to feel that they've got a bit more money and things feel a bit better. And I would say that, on a positive note, that consumer and business sentiment have been improving steadily over the course of the last few months. So they're still not very good compared to pre-pandemic levels, but to sort of hit a bright spot, it does look like people are starting to feel a bit more confident about the economy. And certainly both the inflation experienced by the poorest household and also their wage growth seems to have equalised with those further up the income distribution. So hopefully those on the lowest incomes are starting to feel not quite so much under pressure. So I'll leave it there, but happy to take any questions after the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Mairi. That's great. Very insightful and an excellent broad overview of where we are, including some of the intricacies that are at play, but not always all that apparent, like how the fiscal framework operates, a bit on tax changes and what they mean, and also digging a bit into the budget lines and what it might mean for charities. And related to that, leads me nicely to our next speaker, which is Sheghley Ogilvie from SCVO, who will be getting a bit into what the budget means or doesn't for charities here in Scotland. Before I pass over to Sheghley, just a reminder that if you have any questions throughout, please stick them in the Q&A, not the chat, as I said at the start, along with who you are, your organisation, and who the question is for. Okay, Sheghley, I'll pass over to you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to begin with a reminder I think it's unlikely that anyone here needs, and that is that Scotland's voluntary sector is under pressure. In April, the third sector tracker found that demand for support had increased for 63% of voluntary organisations. 92% of organisations working directly with the public highlighted worsening emerging needs. 45% of voluntary organisations reported cost increases, and 71% of organisations reported that financial issues were among their top 3 challenges. The latest wave of the third sector tracker, which just finished in November, is still being analysed, but some of the results we do have is that it's found that 44% of voluntary organisations reported that cost increases were among their top 3 challenges, so very similar to the April findings. And the majority of organisations who took part in November also believed that the third sector would be in a little less or much less positive place in 12 months' time. As I've said, the latest wave of results is still being analysed, and we'll have the full statistics over the next month to provide the complete updated picture. But it's clear that our sector continues to face unprecedented challenges and that we needed urgent action in the Scottish budget. So today I'm going to offer an overview of some of the actions we believe could have been taken to ensure our sector was recognised, supported and resourced. But I'm going to begin with a bit of a disclaimer, very similar to Mairi, and that is that in my experience, it's difficult to truly understand the impact of the Scottish budget on the voluntary sector. As we all know, the voluntary sector is hugely diverse and organisations receive funding from many different Scottish Government departments. How funding flows to the sector from departments isn't broken down, and as a result, an overall picture of what the budget invests in the sector and if this investment increases or decreases is not available. So sorry for anyone who's looking forward to that, because I'll not be able to provide that for you today. This picture is further complicated as well. Some voluntary organisations are funded through government. Funding is also received from third parties, such as independent funders or public bodies, and local government, as Mirren's going to discuss shortly. SCVO continue to call for action to be taken on funding transparency to enable us to better understand funding flows to the voluntary sector and other sectors and the impact of Scottish Government's spending decisions. In the meantime, there are a number of areas where the budget can and should take action to support the sector, and spoiler alert, and I think Mairi's touched on this too, we didn't see the commitments we'd hoped and in some cases really expected in the budget. And the first area that I'm going to touch on is more funding for the voluntary sector. So this year was a unique opportunity in this space. And I say unique in the sense that we're often told that UK government is the barrier to more funding for the sector's work. But in the spring statement, the UK Chancellor Jeremy Hunt recognised the extraordinary pressure of the cost of living and running cost crisis on the voluntary sector by introducing over 100 million of additional support for charities and communities in England. So a modest but welcome package of support, and it recognised some of the challenges impacting our sector, particularly rising energy costs. And as a result of that announcement, there was just under 10 million of Barnett consequentials for Scotland, and that was front-loaded over 2 years. So we could have seen some of that in the budget, but so far the Scottish Government haven't committed to use these consequentials for the sector in Scotland. So obviously that's quite disappointing. Yeah. Another area where it's possible to see if there's been an increase or a decrease in voluntary sector funding is the third sector budget line. And that's something, you know, we've discussed before for anyone who's been at these sessions before. So the third sector budget line exclusively funds the sector, and it's an area where comparable figures are available each year. The budget line is a very small part of the government's overall investment in the sector, and it funds SCVO, as an example, and other voluntary sector infrastructure organisations and projects. And this year, the third sector budget line remained largely the same at 21.1 million. So it actually fell slightly, as last year it was 21.2 million. And the third sector unit who control the budget line will share information with organisations they fund, you know, as quickly as possible about their funding from that line. However, as the third sector budget line is one of the few budget lines where you can see the government's investment in the sector, a standstill budget is a big disappointment. So despite rising costs and the need for pay uplifts, there was no suggestion within the budget that the Scottish Government have budgeted for inflation-based uplifts in grant funding and contracts. And that's despite SCVO calling for this for many years and really showcasing the impact of rising costs on voluntary organisations, their workforce, volunteers, and ultimately the services and support that we all provide. As we all know, standstill budgets are not sustainable for the voluntary sector. I feel like a bit of a broken record saying that again, or our staff, volunteers, or the communities that we work with. And I think that leads quite nicely onto something else we expected to strongly feature within the budget, and that was fairer funding for the voluntary sector. I'm sure we've all seen that being thrown around. Over the last year, SCVO have stressed that fair funding for the voluntary sector is urgently needed. Fair funding is a long-term, flexible, sustainable and accessible approach to funding. SCVO welcomed the Scottish Government's commitments to move towards fairer funding for the voluntary sector by 2026, but there was little action on that in the budget. The Scottish Government made commitments to fairer funding, and do note the difference. They talk about fairer funding, but SCVO we talk about fair funding, something that we've actually defined. And in last year's budget, this year's policy prospectus, and the Programme for Government all mentioned fairer funding. Ahead of his keynote speech at the gathering, the First Minister also committed to developing a fairer funding approach in Third Force News, and he specifically referenced prompt notification of funding, outcomes-based flexible funding, and proportionate administration around applications and reporting, all as prioritised aspects. And I'm happy to share a link to that after I finish talking if anyone wants to read it. And despite this, the budget offered only a vague commitment. And I'm just going to quote, because there's only one reference, so it's quite easy for me to cover that in this talk. So he said, our work on efficiency levers will include a review of grant models in operation, guided by our commitments to fairer funding for the third sector. So this is hugely disappointing, as over a year on from the first commitment to fairer funding, there's been very little progress, and what Scottish Government mean by fairer funding for the voluntary sector has yet to be defined. Although progress on multi-year funding does seem to be a central element, and I think we can say that because in the Programme for Government, when fairer funding was discussed, they said fairer funding arrangements, including exploring options to implement multi-year funding deals. So there's a few elements of fairer funding that we can think what they mean from some of the things they said, but generally it hasn't really been defined. Within the budget, the single mention to fairer funding, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, sat next to the words efficiency levers. So slightly concerning, and I'm sure not what we all have in mind when we're thinking about fairer funding for the voluntary sector. And explaining what Scottish Government means by fairer funding, ideally aligning with the fairer funding principles SCVO works with the sector to develop, and developing timelines and goals for this work to progress and be monitored should now be a priority. On multi-year funding, Action was also not taken in the budget, as despite the First Minister's firm assurance at the gathering that multi-year funding is very much underway, a single year plan for 24-25 was published, with a commitment from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Shona Robinson, to revising a multi-year funding plan in the medium-term financial strategy. So again, disappointing. We'd been assured by the First Minister that once the budget work was completed, government would advise to what extent they can bring forward multi-year funding, and this would include a greater number of at least 2-year grants. So we're kind of in a similar position that we've been in before, that positive rhetoric and agreement about the many benefits of multi-year funding across government and Parliament continues not to progress into action from Scottish Government. Over the next year, SCVO will continue to hold Scottish Government to account on these issues, and the Deputy First Minister recently made a commitment to ensure that voluntary organisations receiving funding from the Scottish Government will receive their notifications in March. As I'm sure many people are aware, timely notifications are part of SCVO's fair funding calls, and we welcome this commitment. And it's something that we plan to progress and monitor over the next year. So if that's something that you would like to get involved in, then you can contact my colleague, Jason Henderson. So it's just the same as my email there, jason.henderson@scvo.scot. And he is putting together a group who will be filling in a survey, to say, how has their funding progressed? Have they had prompt notifications of their funding for the next financial year? So just if that's something that you'd like to be involved in. SCVO also called on the Scottish Government to resource living wage uplifts and grants and contracts as part of expanding the Scottish Government's Fair Work First criteria and delivering on becoming a Fair Work Nation by 2025. But again, there was no evidence of action on that in the budget. And I'm just going to finish on the wider implications. So as I mentioned earlier, local councils fund far more voluntary organisations than Scottish Government. And as has also been mentioned already, last year, the council tax freeze was announced at the SNP Party conference. This freeze supports households in the top income decile rather than the poorest households, most likely to rely on some voluntary sector services. And while the Scottish Government have said they are fully funding the freeze, and we've discussed that a bit already, and I'm sure Mirren will have more to say, any reduction or impact on local services could result in increased demand on our sector and could affect the many organisations who receive council funding, especially as local councils, like the sector, are struggling with rising costs. The fallout from the local government settlement is therefore likely to be significant. Voluntary organisations working in different thematic areas have also noted that cuts to individual budget lines will impact on the services that can be provided, such as housing, and it's not unfair to assume that that could lead to cuts in the funding available to voluntary organisations, although of course it's too early to have any evidence of that, but I don't think we're jumping to any huge conclusions, by thinking that that might be the case. And to conclude, the voluntary sector is central to achieving the Scottish Government's ambitions of equality, opportunity and community. We're also a vital social and economic actor, employing 5% of Scotland's workforce and working with 1.2 million volunteers. And as has been the case many times before, this budget didn't recognise that. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Sheghley, for taking us through a number of the pressures that are facing the sector as a whole just now, what is and isn't visible for the sector in the budget process, and crucially, how the budget measured up against SCVO's fair funding asks. And you got in a bit there into fairer funding and the crucial differences between that. Also, which leads us on to our next speaker very nicely, you got into some of what this means for local government. So we'll now hear from Mirren at COSLA with the local government perspective on the impact of the budget, and along with what it might mean for the voluntary sector. Before I pass over, just a reminder to stick your questions in the Q&A function, along with who you are, who you're representing today and who your question is directed at. So there's a few come in already. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Mirren.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting us to speak here. I think it's fair to say the local government view of the budget is not positive. So some of the headline figures you've hopefully sort of seen from some of our social media and press releases already anyway. The budget represents a cash cut to our expected revenue income of 63 million. And I want to sort of explain that a bit. You see lots of claims that there is a 5% real terms increase in terms of the amount of funding local government has received. There is an increase in the actual amount of money that is being passed over. However, all of that money and more has been committed to other purposes. It was either money that we'd been promised to support the pay deal, or known monies to come in for 24-25 for other commitments, such as what already referenced, the £12 an hour in adult social care, early learning, etc. So once you add in everything that we were expecting and had been promised for 23-24, and then what we knew we should be getting for 24-25, that's where the 63 million gap comes from. So we're starting from a deficit position. So that will obviously, that means that within the settlement, there is no funding within revenue to support inflation or to support pay during 24-25. And we're starting from a point of having to make cuts even before you take that into account. So this will obviously clearly have a big impact on local authority direct and commission services, and we know that the third sector are key partners in significant numbers of commission services, and in particular local authorities will be having to consider some really difficult decisions around non-statutory services in particular, but also how statutory services are delivered, given the pressures. It's probably worth highlighting that local government have been managing cuts like this for over a decade now. So there has been the chipping away and chipping away and chipping away, which is what the third sector will also have been feeling, and the pressures that puts everyone under. And there is no easy space for anyone to move to now. There are only really difficult decisions left, which will have impacts on individuals, on communities and organisations. So from the capital side, it's worse, actually, and we know that will also have an impact within the third sector space. There's again, similarly, in terms of what we were expecting versus what we got, there was a £37 million direct cut to core capital. So that means funding to address things like maintaining the community spaces that we have, dealing with issues like RAC and other ongoing maintenance, as well as any hopes for sort of investment in other bits. All of that has been cut. There is also cuts, further sort of 20 million-ish cuts in specific revenue grants. And then even beyond that, there are much, much bigger cuts in capital funding that affect local governments. So particularly the Affordable Housing Supply Programme, which has been enormously cut. And a 37% cut to that programme over the last 2 years will have a huge impact on communities, on the housing, but will also, as Mairi was talking about, will have an impact on the economy, because that will be a huge chunk of the economy that is being cut back and will not be taken forward, and that will have an impact on the expected economic success compared to rest of UK, and a subsequent knock-on effect on block grant adjustments. There are other areas of funding that we've seen cuts as well, things like the regeneration capital grant funding, specific funding streams, which I think are often delivered by third sector partners, are at risk. So, basically every area of the budget is under significant pressure and risk. As alluded to, the council tax freeze certainly does not help. And it is definitely, in our view, not fully funded. To claim that something is fully funded when you're starting from a deficit position is not a reasonable position to take. So at best, our view of the funding offers is that it's equivalent to roughly a 2.8% increase in council tax at best. Now, there's been a number of sort of surveys and things gone out. LGIU did one recently that showed that it was around 85% of councils were looking at increasing council tax more than 5%. 5% was a minimum. And if you've sort of listened to any of the directors of finance that gave evidence to the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee, that, you know, there were several who were saying, well, they started at potentially a 5% assumption. And obviously it's a political decision. So it's really, you know, it's a really challenging one to sort of agree what you would or wouldn't have maybe sort of had agreed. But what one director of finance gave the example that they'd been assuming looking at a 5%, but given the cut, given the 63 million gap that they've been presented with, they'd be looking at more like 8% to deal with that. So the idea that this council tax is fully funded is just not one that we support for a number of reasons. And that's even before you get into the points that are being made of what were councils looking at. Is 5% a reasonable number? We're of the view that no, the majority of councils were looking at beyond 5%, and therefore it's not fully funded. And then also whether or not you should be taking into account things such as the potential for the multipliers consultation on that. Other things that are probably worth picking up, the multi-year budgets. We share your frustration on that, where when we don't have, while councils have medium-term financial planning, there's only so much risk that they will be able to take on in terms of putting forward multi-year budgets to yourselves when we don't have that. I know that some councils do try and do that, but it's not something that local government's are able to sort of facilitate on a consistent basis when we're not receiving multi-year budgets ourselves. And absolutely aware of the vast inefficiencies that also causes in the system. The fact that means that you potentially lose really good staff and expertise as they're having to look for new jobs, the impact that has on service delivery, the impact that has on the individuals that are receiving sort of the support and services that are provided. But if you don't have certainty of who's going to be, maybe, you know, who's helping you out, the relationship loss that has, and the impact that therefore has on outcomes. Another thing I wanted to sort of just touch on in terms of challenge, we've heard it was sort of picked up about the pay, and that heard quite frequently from DFM and others that they're looking to reduce headcount. We've repeatedly pointed out that in local government and the services we provide either directly or in partnership are frontline services, and there's many of those that you cannot reduce the headcount for and still deliver what is being asked to deliver. There are things like the 1140 hours. There are staffing requirements. We can't change that. Adult social care, you need your care workers to be delivering it. They're not replaceable by efficiencies. There are other policy commitments by Scottish Government in terms of things like teacher numbers, which further restrict kind of the options that councils might have in terms of dealing with the budget cuts. The teacher pay bill by itself is £3.2 billion. So that's a huge chunk of local government spend that is ring fenced, which means that the cuts have to come from everywhere else. And there are many, many, many areas like that are replicated. We estimate that it's really difficult to track because it's policies that have been added in over the years and potentially been baselined, but that doesn't mean that you can make cuts to them. So, for instance, although the funding for the 1140 hours has been baselined, we still have to deliver that, and that's now been baselined into a budget that has been cut by £63 million. But we can't deliver less than 1140 hours. Similarly, the baselining of the funding that supports the real living wage and adult social care, you can't deliver £12 an hour without paying the previous £10.90. The idea that there's flexibility in what has been baseline just isn't true. And I think I also wanted to pick up something that I know that is an issue, that the Fair Work First policy is another one that we've sort of flagged as a real challenge, but for actually directly for local government, in terms of the fact that it's a commitment beyond even the real living wage foundation requirements themselves, in terms of the payments for apprentices and the potential knock-on effect that has. But also councils have hugely and have raised very vocally the concerns that they have that the conditionality means in terms of being able to work with long-standing partners in both the private and third sector on this. And as rightly identified, there has not been a single additional penny put into any of the grants that come forward to support this, even though it introduced potentially really significant costs to organisations and delivery of services, as particularly where you need to maintain differentials within an organisation, otherwise it's just not viable. So I think that I don't have very much positive news on this, and I think it's going to be a really tough year for all of us, genuinely. And you can see that we've been we are sort of lobbying around kind of the impact that this has sort of for local government, and therefore for our communities and the individuals in them. So happy to pause there.
Thank you very much, Mirren. That's all very useful. It's very useful to hear some of the details behind the headlines on the local government settlement, and by extension, obviously very worrying to hear the difficult decisions facing local government, because obviously the knock-on consequences that would have for the sector as a whole, along with the sort of history of financial constraints facing local government, taking us to the position today. So thank you very much, but we'll move to questions. So a few have come in, so I'll just kick them off with using the Q&A function. So I'll start with quite a general one, which I'll point at Sheghley and Mairi in the first instance, but Mirren, if you want to come in on this as well, certainly more than welcome. So from an anonymous attendee, we've got the First Minister attended the SCVO gathering, and a key message from his speech was around looking at multi-year funding for the third sector organisations, but the budget didn't deliver. Do we see a real commitment from the Scottish Government towards the third sector, or was his speech warm words and playing to the audience? So I could bring in Sheghley there, and Mairi, you obviously said you had a degree of sympathy on the position the Scottish Government's in around multi-year funding, so it would be useful to hear from you on that as well. So I'll bring in Sheghley first.
Yeah, this question made me smile. I feel like this is almost a matter of opinion, isn't it? Because we've had sort of these commitments for so long, and do we believe them or do we think is warm words? I think everyone would have a different opinion on that. I do believe that he is sincere on his ambition to deliver multi-year funding, even though it's been a really long time and it still hasn't happened. I think, as Mairi said, we do have an election year. The UK government don't offer multi-year budgets. I think they haven't since the financial crash, but Mairi can maybe correct me if I'm wrong on that. So I think they are in a tricky situation. I think that we really did expect to see something in the budget, and ahead of the budget, there was it felt like something was going to happen, in discussion with sort of the third sector unit and others. It felt like we were on the verge of something, but unfortunately it also felt like that last year, before Nicola Sturgeon resigned. It also felt like we were on the verge of something then, and then she left, and there was lots of murmurs then as well that something was about to happen on multi-year funding, and then obviously it didn't. At SCVO, we've tried to offer some solutions. For example, when we gave evidence to the Social Security Committee, we suggested multi-year funding across some funds, and then, you know, the Scottish Government to review those, to review that, you know, to see the positive impacts that had. But even that didn't seem to happen. So yeah, so I think, how are they going to achieve it by fairer funding, you know, which includes multi-year funding by 2026, when we haven't seen any action? I don't know. I do think they want to achieve it, and part of me can't really understand what the issue is. So I pass on to Mairi for that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, despite what the noises that we also heard coming out of government, like really positive noises, like this time it'll happen. I kind of had this in the back of my mind after the autumn statement, that the lack of reality from the UK government would be used as an excuse to not do it again. And it's sort of like it's the next excuse that's been brought out not to do it. I think that's a more reasonable one than some of the ones in the past, maybe. So I completely understand your frustration, that it sort of never happened, despite repeated assurances that it would happen. But it really did feel quite positive this time. So I'm not surprised if nobody believes it's going to happen in the medium-term financial strategy, or that it will be at such a high level, you know, in terms of portfolios or something, that it really doesn't tell us anything, kind of like the RSR in 2022. That it's not helpful, you know, it's not commitments, it's just, you know, broad portfolios given what they know about UK government outlooks for funding. I think the broader point about commitments and rhetoric and then action is probably what maybe I think what the questioner is getting at, that these commitments are made and then the action doesn't back them up. I mean, there's these commitments that have been given to the third and voluntary sector. There's the Very House Agreement, which as soon as it was signed, you know, council tax freeze was announced, that, you know, so basically political expediency at a conference speech trumped all of that work to get the Very House Agreement. You know, that's what it seems like from the outside. And it just feels like it's undermining an agreement that was made to no surprises and consultation and co-production. And you can see that that might happen with the business community, for example, through the New Deal for Business. You know, unless actual action shows that the government are taking these things seriously, then there's no point in these agreements. So I think the government do have an issue here, that they need to show that these commitments are something that they will stick to, even if they've got a political speech next week and they need a good announcement in it, which is what it felt like for the council tax freeze. So I think for local government, for the third sector, for the business community, I think everybody's waiting to see if the government's actually going to walk the walk and all of this stuff, instead of just promising that they will, you know, consult, co-produce, no surprises, all of these sorts of things.
Thank you very much. Mirren, you want to come in at all on this?
I guess I think it's fair to say that there is that balance in terms of multi-year settlements. There's a risk that a multi-year settlement, when Scottish Government don't have sufficient information, is so full of assumptions as to be pointless. And is it therefore better to wait and have the detail? But there have been stronger indications of funding kind of on a multi-year space from UK government that maybe would have allowed better, which we could see. I think there was an attempt of within the resource spending review, but it does provide a level of challenge. The resource spending review is better than nothing, but it's not brilliant, and it doesn't really allow local government the confidence to set multi-year budgets themselves. So I think that's where some of it is, and there is that balance to be struck. Do you set a budget when you know you don't know the figures and then you have to redo it, or do you wait and have single year budgets and last minute cycles and all of that? And it's a real challenge kind of around that. One of the things as well, though, I would point out is one of the things we've seen with this is that even where there's an indication of what the funding might look like, we don't necessarily have an indication of what additional policy expectations the government might be seeking to introduce in that period. So there might be an indication that there will be an expected increase of funding of £100 million in 2 years' time, but we don't know what else they've added in that they're expecting us to deliver for that. It's not necessarily just extra money to deal with the pay and inflation and all of those pressures that we see. So.
Thank you very much. So what I'll do is I'll move to Lynn at the TSI Scotland Network's got a question. So I'll stay with you, Mirren, if that's okay, and then others can come in if they would like. Lynn's question is, what might the likely implications of the new planned fiscal framework mean for charities? So question refers to the LA fiscal framework. So, for example, are we likely to see more internalising of functions away from third sector into public bodies?
So that's certainly not the intention of the fiscal framework between Scottish and local government. The intention is to have an enhanced and clearer relationship about the fiscal relationship that we have. So some key things we're seeking and have agreed, and hopefully will be, and unfortunately with timing this year, some of the progress we haven't seen that we would have hoped for. But some of the things it's to build in like early budget engagement. And by early budget engagement, I mean that we want to be speaking to ministers in May about the next budget, not in September, October, December when it's set. It is like very early budget engagement. There are then other elements, sort of including processes for how we might look to take forward opportunities for local revenue raising, where that might be appropriate. For instance, were the visitor levy just coming in now, we'd expect it to come through a process linked to the fiscal framework. But it's not about the delivery function part of local government. It's about the fiscal relationship and attempting to get kind of more, and it's mutual certainty. Like it's not just gives or gains from local government. It's actually how do we have that joint and mature relationship with Scottish government to understand kind of the implications of budgets, but also hopefully like to provide a better framework for having the difficult conversations where they need to be had, which we're all aware of they do, because there are so many commitments and there is not enough money to deliver on them.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anyone else like to come in on the new planned local government fiscal framework and what this might mean for charities? No, that's absolutely fine. Lynn's got another question, which we'll come back to. It's a very good question. But there's another question here from an anonymous attendee. So the Scottish Government get a variety of devolved funds specifically given to the third sector in England, but don't necessarily pass on the full consequentials like for like. What can we do collectively as a sector to lobby for devolving the consequentials? So what I'll do here, I'll talk a wee bit about our fair funding campaign work, pass over to Sheghley if she's got anything to add. And Mairi, I don't know if you want to come in generally on Barnett consequentials and how that all works. So in terms of what we can do collectively as a sector to lobby for devolving the consequentials. So this was one of our budget asks. So in spring statement last year, the Chancellor announced around about £100 million for the voluntary sector down the road for cost of living measures, primarily energy support, I understand. One of our asks was for those consequentials amounting to about £10 million to be passed on to the sector up here. It's not enough, but it's not nothing. So that was one of our key budget asks. Unfortunately, that wasn't evident from the budget that we saw that. But we will, of course, as an organisation, be continuing to push for consequentials like that to be passed on in full to the sector, and alongside our fair funding asks for the sector. So we're not going away on that front. As Sheghley mentioned, we'll have comms and campaigns pack coming out imminently, which my colleague Jason Henderson will be sending out. So that should give voluntary organisations what they need to hold decision makers here in Scotland to account on fair funding issues, including passing on consequentials to the sector. Shelley, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
I think maybe the main thing I would add is sort of the transparency point. So thinking about the 10 million in Barnet consequentials from the spring statement announcement, even if Scottish Government had said to us that they had, that they had went ahead and they had, given those consequentials to the sector, because it is so difficult to see how funding flows to the sector in the budget, basically Scottish Government could say that to me, but I would have no way to actually see the evidence of that, because it's not clear how funding flows to the sector, and it flows through so many different departments and budget lines, with the exception of the third sector budget line, which you can see year on year. So I think a real problem is that if we want to see things like have consequentials being passed on, we need a more transparent budget, and we don't have one. And I'm happy to share, some of our work on transparency and some of the things that we've been calling for anyone who's interested. And it's something we'll continue to work on over the next year. And I know Scottish Government are doing, some work in that space with the Open Government Partnership, and the Scottish Exchequer have been, doing some work for that. So I'm happy to share all that. But I think in short, it's really difficult for us to work collectively on something like Barnet consequentials when the Scottish Government, they haven't said this, and they won't this year, but they have in previous years. When there was cuts, for example, to the third sector budget line, they said, oh no, that's not a cut, that's actually going through other budget lines, other departments, but they can't evidence that to us. And in the end, it was about 8 months later or something, it turned out, yeah, the money had been a cut. They admitted that, yeah, actually that money, So yeah, so that's just a couple of examples to show that without transparency, it's really difficult for us to do work in this space. But I'm sure Mairi has more to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just absolutely agree that there's so much more the Scottish Government could do to make things more transparent, whether it's looking at what is actually spent in a year on something rather than what was planned to be spent. I mean, that seems like a simple thing, but trying to get, a comparison of what they plan to spend, what they actually spent, to then the plans, instead of just looking at the planned budgets each year, which is what they do at the moment as a convention, which is ridiculous. They have been producing more information on a functions of government basis, which does allow you to see what has been spent. The Fiscal Commission have released a report this morning looking at what was actually spent on things rather than the plans for spending on things. But this is all just as a mire. I mean, it's not relevant now what they plan to spend in 22-23. It's what they spent that matters, and what they spent on different functions, especially given the in-year movements we have seen over the last couple of years, which have been massive in historical terms. So we really need to understand what has been spent in the end, not what was planned to be spent. And that's before you even get to who does the delivery. So you said you spent this on social care or mental health services or whatever it is, but then who are the bodies that are delivering that? And really understanding that is what Shelley's talking about, to understand whether the money to the sector, for example, is being inflation linked, or it is increasing to cover increased energy costs or whatever it might be. So it is really difficult to find out what's going on. And it does make it quite difficult for lobbying for things like Barnet consequentials to be passed on. The other thing I would say as well is we've been working for the last few years with the sector, and we've just kicked off a big research project looking at how we better quantify and communicate the economic impact of the sector. So it's not just a sector that delivers services, it's a sector that is important in local economies, employs people. It's an economic actor as well. So we're trying to do more research to be able to make the sector more visible as, you know, a part of the economy and an important part to invest in, to ensure that, you know, communities are supported, local jobs are supported, and so on.
Thank you very much. That's all tremendously useful. Just on, so Mirren, are you want to come in on the transparency issue at all and how that might affect local government or by extension the sector?
Just to lend support to what was said, it is incredibly difficult to track sort of all of this. We try and do it, and that is one of the areas that we would hope the fiscal framework would lead to some improvements. But there are real challenges, and for us it's really unhelpful because the mixed information just creates a feeling of mistrust across communities. So if you have the situation where any politician in Scottish Parliament is standing up and saying, well, it's an increase in funding to local government or any other partner, and then local government locally saying it's a cut, we've got to cut your services, stop providing this support, stop delivering this thing that you value, because then it's that mismatch, and that doesn't help anyone. And it doesn't allow for the difficult and honest conversations that we need to have about where the priorities really lie and what decisions we have to make around that. So absolutely a huge problem is tracking. It's the in-year additions that are never reflected when you compare, because they always compare against the budget that was published last year. So in the case of local government, there was about 300 million quid added in for to support pay deals within the year. So what looks like a big increase to our funding, it is actually just for the pay deal. And what we would say is funding we should have received up front to allow us to conduct sort of reasonable pay negotiations.
And that sort of thing's the most egregious, because those are quite obviously recurring costs. You know, you increase somebody's pay, you've got to pay them that the next year also. And so that example in 2023 was particularly egregious, of comparing budgets to budgets when the SG know that these are recurring costs that local government are facing.
Okay, thank you very much. Lots of food for thought there on transparency and accessibility of the budget process. I'll go to another question from Lynn, and I'll stay with you, Mirren. It's what impact, so it's Lynn from the TSI Scotland Network, what impact assessment has COSLA councils taken forward to look what further local cuts mean, and how will councils engage with local third sector organisations / TSIs to discuss the local decisions being made? And by extension, I'll take Shelley and Mairi after that if they've got anything further to say on how the sector should be engaged going forward, because it's a crucial partner in the delivery of public services, obviously in the economy, and we're in a pretty difficult financial situation at the moment. So Mirren, I'll take you first on engagement between local government, COSLA and the third sector.
So I think it is one that we try and capture, but it's genuinely quite a difficult one. So from COSLA's perspective, we're representing all 32 local authorities, and the way services are delivered, the impact that cuts will have, the local priorities do differ in every area. So in terms of it's one of the challenges, and if anyone's got sort of good suggestions on how we can improve it, but genuinely capturing what the impact on the ground is something that we would like to be better at, because I think that helps illustrate the impact of the decisions that are being taken around budgets. Partly the issue is that until councils are currently working and have been working for months on potential options to deal with budget pressures. And those will be developed sort of with officers, with communities, and with elected members. But until they're kind of put forward, you don't necessarily know what what has been decided that is or isn't kind of potentially somewhere that might have to be looked at. So it can be quite hard to capture the impacts in a live sort of sense. And really, it's probably not until sort of budget options are published that you start to really be able to see it. And you do see kind of the highlights on, quite often it's local news that will pick up the potential impacts, you know, cuts to swimming pools, to libraries, to other areas. But I think so local authorities should be working with, they have to look at statutory duties and delivery, and unfortunately that means and then where there are commitments that we are not allowed to make changes to, which might be things like the instrumental music tuition charge, the removal of fees for that. That's still a policy that exists. So that there's limitations on what can be done, which can sometimes might constrain some of the conversations that are able to be had locally as well. But I think it is somewhere that be really interested in hearing suggestions on how we can improve that assessment of impact, so that we can, you know, be clear about this is what it means when you cut the budgets for these services. And even if the, you know, financial circumstances are really difficult, so we need to be having the conversation of, so if this is the budget, where should the money go? Should it go to local government? Should it go to health? Should it go somewhere else? And why? And what's the impact of that? Should we be having difficult conversations about some of the current universal offers? And do we have to make different decisions? Or do we keep delivering those, but recognise that the opportunity cost is that you're not delivering this other bit? So it's always a challenge.
So Lynn's come in again saying discussion with the sector from the early stages would actually help with understanding the likely impact. And I'm sure TSI Scotland Network will be short of ideas for how you can engage with the third sector on that front.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to flag the earliest stage was the 19th of December.
Of course.
This is one of the things that is a difficulty within the single year. And we have to have the same conversation every year. This isn't efficient for councils to be having this conversation every single year with everyone, instead of being able to have so this is what it looks like for 3 years. We can actually make some plans, and they might be difficult, but they're probably easier to manage over a multi-year period. But the early engagement is hard to do when we don't know our budgets as well. So.
Thank you very much, Mirren. So we've got 4 minutes left. Mairi and Shelley, do you have anything to come in on partnership working between local government, Scottish government, and the sector in these difficult financial circumstances? Please do come in if you do.
I think I would just see, the discussion that we're having just now as an opportunity to engage and, a reminder really for local government to engage with, the TSI network. And so I don't think that's one for me to wade into. I'm sure they can make those connections following this session.
Yeah, and I guess, it needs to be considered by, it's linked to this transparency issue where, us really understanding the impact is down to delivery from different decisions that are made by the Scottish Government in many cases. But when we think about public service reform or doing things differently, the role of the third or voluntary sector in those decisions needs to be considered very carefully. Quite often, and in many cases, the voluntary sector can do a better job of delivering services that are appropriate for communities or end users for various reasons. They can be a source of innovation in delivery of services, and there's many instances of that. And all of these things, but they then need to be through commissioning, need to be kind of rewarded for that innovation and it be encouraged, and then be scalable, rather than the sort of endless pilots we have, for example, in social care. So there are lots of opportunities to utilise expertise innovation in the voluntary sector to do things in a better way. So, I mean, this needs to be considered more widely through public service reform discussions that the Scottish Government are having, with the third sector given that parity of esteem as an innovative and important deliverer of services.
I'm sure that will be music to everyone's ears, what you're saying there. We'll sort of finish on that optimistic note then. So I think we're just about running up against 11:15. So just want to say thanks to everyone for coming along, and a big special thank you to our speakers for taking the time to speak to us today. So that's Mairi, Sheghley and Mirren. Thank you. Obviously, this session today has been recorded. We'll make it available on SCVO's YouTube channel shortly. And I think this is something that's been mentioned already, myself and Sheghley, but for those who are interested in SCVO's fair funding work, look out for Campaigns and Comms Toolkit, which will be circulating shortly, which we hope will give you everything you need to champion the need for fair funding for the sector and put that message directly to decision makers here in Scotland as well. So I will draw things to a close. Thanks for everyone coming along, and a big special thanks to our speakers.